Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Staunton. I'm the British Consul-General based in Atlanta. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this event on climate justice. Climate justice is about fairness. It's at the centre of the United Kingdom's government's approach to climate ambition. We want climate change that is both inclusive and we want to bring many voices to the table. We are delighted to be facilitating this morning's event as we want to create a space for a dialogue about climate justice and to ensure that the United Kingdom's climate change agenda is based on environmental and climate justice. We're delighted to be partnering with the Trust for Public Land. The Trust's mission is about providing green spaces to enhance public access around 4 pillars of health, equity, inclusion, and economics. The UK government's role today is about listening and learning. We want to understand the impacts of climate change and the shocks associated with it on diverse communities and communities of colour. The events of the last week have shown how fragile we are in terms of battling things like adverse weather. Texas is still getting to grips with a really, really difficult situation. But we also understand that for many, climate change might feel like a theoretical debate, but it's not. It's practical. It matters to everybody at all times. We're seeing in the United Kingdom, for example, that minority communities often feel shocks more deeply and they have more consequences for their everyday life. If you look at our response to COVID-19, for example, we're beginning to see that Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities have a higher level of infection, are harder hit by unemployment, and have more vaccine hesitancy. So what we're about today is to try and create a conversation to understand what's happening in Atlanta and the state of Georgia in this area. Our approach is based on a One Health agenda. Why Atlanta and why One Health? Well, you both have the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention here, but you also have many diverse communities, many communities of colour who are embracing and experiencing and calling for climate justice. And for me, climate justice has to be looked at through, yes, the scientific lens, yes, the diversity lens, but also one through jobs and opportunities. Because in the United Kingdom, we firmly believe that we can build and transform our economy through a green industrial revolution, but that we also have to be active internationally. And it's a pleasure to have this event when the United States has re-entered the Paris Climate Change Accord. As we all build towards the Conference of Parties, the International Climate Change Conference, which is taking place in my home city of Glasgow in Scotland in November 2021, we want to ensure that climate justice, environmental justice, diversity justice are all at the forefront of the agenda for that international gathering, because it's important that we build back better, but we build back in a way that's fair and that brings everybody with us, including the most diverse communities. So I'm going to hand you over now to Jocelyn Dorsey, who's going to guide us as moderator through our conversation. We have an excellent panel today, and we've got more than 100 people registered for the event. Jocelyn is the right person to lead this conversation, not only in her role as a board member for the Trust for Public Lands, but also as a broadcaster with many years of experience. She's been breaking barriers for many years. She's been advocating both as a female African-American broadcaster, but also a climate activist. So I'm delighted to hand over to Jocelyn, and I'm really excited to hear the views of the panelists and anything that the British government can do to help this debate, the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Consul-General Staunton. I certainly appreciate the fact that you have included people of color in the discussion because they are so often overlooked. Before we begin the discussion, and I'm delighted to be asked to host this session, but before we begin, I'd like to introduce our state director of Georgia and Alabama, which is really the southern hub for the Trust for Public Land, to explain a little bit about the role of the Trust for Public Land, and that's George Dusenberry. I should mention that he got his start, and I know he would love for me to mention this, but he got his start of environmental activism while serving with Congressman John Lewis, and in this role, he was responsible for the Congressman's work on transportation, clean air, clean water, and smart growth issues. And that's just one of his titles. He's also served in many governmental positions, and I'm delighted to be a part of his team. George?
Thank you, Jocelyn. I very much appreciate the introduction and hope I'm sharing my screen here. I'll be very quick about this. As Jocelyn said, I am the Georgia, Alabama State Director, the Southern Hub Director for the Trust for Public Land. We're a national organization that's been around for more than 45 years, preserving land and creating parks for people. Here you see just some of the accomplishments that we've been able to do across the country. And as we do our work, we really try to do it, and we've had an office here in Georgia for 30 years, and we've completed over 200 projects. These are three that we're particularly proud of: Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Park, the Atlanta Beltline, Chattahoochee River, where we have helped make a difference in our communities in that regard. We currently are wrapping up a big park on the west side of Atlanta. Cook Park is a 16-acre green infrastructure park that will actually eliminate flooding in 150 acres around the park in a low resource community with its prevalently people of color to allow economic revitalization to go forward there. We believe that parks do not stand in themselves. They basically stand with people, and we do not take enough time to appreciate their impact on us from a public health perspective. People who are in nature have stronger mental and physical health, and communities with parks also are stronger and more resilient because it builds a community cohesion for people spending time in parks. As we approach our work, we are not your typical conservation organization, that we really do focus on community first and community is the center of everything we do. And we approach that work looking through the three lenses of health, equity, and climate. And that was why when the British Consulate reached out to us and asked us to help co-host this panel, it was a no-brainer for us. We are excited to be partnering with the British Consulate in Atlanta, and we are proud to have played some role in helping to put together this panel before you. It's quite an impressive panel, and I have been privileged to work with the three members over the last 20 years. And without further ado, I will leave the stage and allow the experts to talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves in a more formal way, but I want to at least let you know who they are. If I took time to introduce all of them, we would be here the whole hour. They are quite distinguished. I wish I could share all the accolades and awards that they have won, but I know we want to get to our topic matter. So first, I'd like to introduce Angelou Ezilo, and she is an activist, a social entrepreneur and environmental activist, also a TPO alumni. And she is the founder of the international nonprofit Greening Youth Foundation. And if you'd like to talk just a little bit about your role in this and what the organization is about.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for the introduction. And thank you to the British Consulate for Atlanta for just hosting this panel and inviting me to such an important discussion. As you mentioned, I'm a social entrepreneur, and that's exactly the way I like to introduce myself. I have other, hats that I've worn in the past. I'm a trained attorney, and I've certainly spent lots of time at the Trust for Public Land. That's where I got my wings, I like to say. So I'm still very close to that organization. But through my experience in working in the conservation field, at a very young age, I realized that there was a deficit, that there weren't people of color engaged in this movement as much as I think should have been. So that really is what led me, because I had such a love for the environment that started at a young age, yet I didn't see anybody in the field that looked like me. It was so few number of people that were Black and brown working in the environmental space. So that led me out on my quest 15 years ago now, as I'm the founder of Greening Youth Foundation, an organization, as Jocelyn said, that's focused on engaging underrepresented youth and young adults while connecting them to the outdoors and conservation careers. So it really does bring me joy right now, one, to have an administration that gets it, but two, to be working with an organization that's focused on providing those core competencies, introduction to the field, but just the skill sets to really train this next generation of environmental leaders, because that's what we're going to need to really stop the warming of our planet. Is we're going to need a strong workforce, and that's what we're committed to doing at Greening Youth Foundation. So I'm excited to be here to have this conversation with you all.
Well, thank you so much. We're glad to have you. And next, I'll introduce someone who's been in the space for quite some time and is nationally and perhaps internationally known, and that's Nataki Osborne Jelks. I'm sorry. And, you know, she has an incredible story that's very personal that led her into this space. But she is best known as the founder and executive director of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, better known as WAWA. Nataki?
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, and thank you also to TPL and to the British Consulate for convening this conversation on today. So as Jocelyn mentioned, the way that I got into environmental work really is it comes from a very personal place. I'm originally from Mississippi, but grew up for a portion of my childhood in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in what many call the Cancer Alley corridor. And after living in that area, you know, within a mile of pollution generating facilities, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. And it was not that we could, you know, make any strong linkages to her diagnosis and what we may have been exposed to in that area, but really just the fact that that possibility existed gave me this impetus to want to be involved in environmental work and in environmental justice work in particular. And so after that experience, I came to Atlanta, went to Spelman College, and just continued to recognize that certain communities were sometimes disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards and stressors. And at the same time, some of those communities were communities that didn't have a lot of financial resources, didn't have the investments that we need to see in things like infrastructure. And so those things really propelled me to decide to really dedicate my life to working in the environmental field, and just kind of quite organically working with other community residents on the West Side. I helped to co-found the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, which is a community-based organization that is focused on growing a cleaner, greener, healthier, and more sustainable West Atlanta. Our mission simply is to improve the environment and quality of life on the West Side of Atlanta through protecting, restoring, and preserving our community's natural resources. So I've been engaged in that work for a number of years. Our work, spans, advocacy work to making sure that all children have access to nature. We are part of something that we helped to launch last year called the Nature for All Coalition. And so, we're really committed to make sure that not only are we protecting our communities, but that no child or person, regardless of race, class, or geography, where they live, nobody should have, everybody, should have access to environmental education, to meaningful connections with nature, with the outdoors, and we're all about making sure that our community is at the table.
Thank you. And she is being very modest, because when she says she attended Spelman, she majored in chemistry and engineering. So she has a scientific background that I think is very valuable to bringing to this panel. And last but by no means least, I'd like to introduce the person I call the warrior preacher, the warrior pastor. It's Pastor Emeritus Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley, who is Pastor Emeritus at Providence Missionary Baptist Church, but perhaps is not known as the chair of the Interfaith Power and Light Group, which is a huge organization that I'm sure he'll be talking about. Reverend Durley.
Thank you so much for allowing me to join this panel. I feel like the kid on the block when I listen to my co-panelists, because they've been in this for a long time. Let me start off by thanking Ambassador Stoughton and the British Consulate for being sensitive to an issue that means so much to so many people, not just in America, but across the nation. I want to thank my good friend George Dusenberry for the work that they're doing here with the park downtown in the Vine City area, where diversity will be exemplified all throughout. And I cannot say enough about the distinguished moderator, Jocelyn Dorsey, who knows how to get it out of all of us. I never thought that I would be involved with climate change, environmental issues. That was never my concern. I started with Dr. King and Andy Young and John Lewis in 1960 in Nashville, Tennessee. At that time, we were fighting for equal rights, we were fighting for justice, and we were fighting for voting rights. We knew that something was not right because constitutionally, everybody deserved the right to vote. Everybody deserved the right to economic equity. And we fought for those things. And we knew that that was what we would do. And we got caught up in it. We were willing to sacrifice and risk. So for most of my life, I went to Tennessee State University, then I master's from Illinois, doctorate from University of Massachusetts, another master's from Howard. All of those things, what did all of the degrees mean unless they could be actively used to uplift people in the community to which I was called to serve? So I got involved with that. And one of the first things that happened, I said, this is global. So I was in the first Peace Corps group to go to Nigeria in 1964. And that's when I began to see, working with the agricultural department there and the deprivation that people were involved with. But I came back and got involved right back in the civil rights movement here, all through the March on Washington in 1968. And then about 10 years ago, a lady came to Atlanta, Georgia, and started talking about climate change and global warming and the inequities and polar bears that couldn't make it to the next iceberg and trees. That was so foreign to me. I was concerned about human rights and civil rights and justice issues. Then I began to connect the dots. And that's what I do today. I connect the dots because Martin Luther King says that we've got to be the soul of America. And I think the soul of America is environmental issues because soul gives you a life. There can be no life unless the environment is there. So then I began to understand, unless the environment is vibrant, the carbon dioxide and the gas house emissions. And I began to learn all of the technology, but I had to reconnect it. And that's why I'm thankful for this panel today, back into the African-American community and the other communities of color. When I began to see, as Nataka talked about the 85-mile trek down there in Louisiana, Cancer Road, then I began to see the asthmatic condition. Then I began to see the economic deprivation that was negatively, disproportionately impacting the communities of color. That, to me, was the civil rights issue of today. The environmental movement, the civil rights movement, founded upon faith, because I began to see that there was profits over people. And when these major corporations were polluting the air and polluting the water and polluting the stream and causing infectious diseases throughout, I had to do something. So now, I guess where I am now, I chair the Interfaith Power and Light out of San Francisco. We're in 40 states, probably the largest grassroots interfaith group in America. We're in 22,000 houses of Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Shiites, talking about how do we preserve creation care? How do we preserve a world, an environment that was given to us? How do we care for it? How do we begin to go back and bring our various faiths together? So I believe it, as we look at the political, as we begin to look at the educational, as we begin to look at the economical, it all must rest on an ethical and a moral foundation. And that's where the interfaith efforts that we do now tie in with science. Science and faith is not incongruent. So that's the kind of mission that I'm on at this phase of my life.
Thank you, Reverend. And now, we, of course, want this to be a conversation. So I want to bring all the panelists back so we can begin our discussion, because we don't have a lot of time and we've got a lot of ground to cover. But being a broadcaster and up on a news junkie, one of the things, first of all, I'd like to do is say that our prayers and condolences certainly go out to all the people who are affected by the horrible winter storms that have swept across our country, and primarily Texas. And on that note, we're hearing so much about Texas. I just, with the 4 million people who've been without power, and now we've got people without water. It's just a horrible situation that possibly is man-made. And I want to get your response or just your quick reaction to what's going on today with our climate and our weather. And please don't hesitate to speak up. And I don't want to have to call on you, so please feel free to speak up. Reverend Durley.
Right. I think it's an absolute tragedy when you begin to mix people's lives and people's economy and how they make their livelihood with politics. A lot of the political nuances around this was around politics. I asked some people when they talked about the wind turbines down there in Texas that they froze up, and they began to see that, and that was the #1 producer of energy. They said, well, in Canada, we had already worked through that. We understood that we could bring certain wind combines that could face this. They did not put that in. So I don't know who sold the wind turbines. It's all politics and it's all money, because it had already been forecast that something like this would occur. So now all the finger pointing is going to whether it's to the governor or to the other people around it. So I think that we've got to, once again, even though I understand that legislation and politics and setting up standards is absolutely essential in a democracy, but in this case, where you let politics override the kind of efforts, it is tragic. It is horrible what has transpired. I think it could have been at least a lot lesser than what we're seeing now. But that's what I believe. I think it's horrible, and we've got to take politics out of this, even as we move forward to go to Glasgow. We got to get the politics, not the legislature, but the politics out of people's lives and people's well-being.
And it certainly is unfortunate, because the wind turbine issue, only 7% of the power is supplied to Texas, so it's not really an issue. And it was my understanding that there was frozen natural gas lines that really affected a lot of it, and people knew about this 10 years ago. Nataki, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I think you just kind of took my talking points, Jocelyn. So I really was just going to say that, even though there are some that I feel like are deflecting and sort of pointing fingers, at the clean energy solutions that have been implemented in Texas, they just represent such a small portion of the energy that is produced. So this widespread failure that we have seen cannot be attributed to the clean energy resources. And so I think that it's a political thing that people are trying to put that out there and to cast dispersion there, when, in fact, the problem is with the dirty, polluting, energy, that is created not only in Texas, but in so many other places. And so there had not obviously been the proper protocols put in place to winterize this grid. And because of politics and kind of the deregulation, if you will, that has happened, in Texas and other places, that's in part why we see some of these challenges.
Anjali?
Yeah, and obviously they kind of took all the points, but I would just add that, it really is a travesty that we're seeing climate be politicized. There's so much. I was just watching actually an interview with Bill Gates the other night, talking about how aggressive we need to be within the next several decades, and that we need government to really take a role and to act smarter, and that we have to be bolder, and that we have to really be aggressive with this. And when I see, the finger pointing, as to what happened in Texas and how politicized it's become, it saddens me. And it's not just Texas, unfortunately. It's all over the globe, as we're seeing, the flooding and the droughts and the mudslides. It literally is happening all over the country, which is the world, which is why we have to make it priority.
And I should mention today is a global day because the United States has officially joined the Paris Climate Accord. Just a quick reaction, round robin, on what you think about that and what's ahead for the United States and its role.
Thank God is my immediate response. I mean, we have to be a part of people who are thinking forward and thinking about solutions. And for us to not be a part of this group was really, once again, a travesty. So I'm really happy to see this current administration make climate, equity, health, economics, all the things, their pillars, but particularly them joining the Paris Accord. So it's a great day for me here.
Yeah, I'm excited as well that we are, again, saying that we're pledging to be leaders. I think that that's very important, especially when you look at the emissions that we contribute to. We must be leaders in helping to reduce those emissions, and in terms of taking bold action to combat climate change. So I think that I'm just very glad to see that that was a part of the agenda, and that so quickly into this administration that we're elevating these issues.
I think it's absolutely fantastic. As Dr. King says, none of us are free until we're all free. None of us are an island. So what goes on in England, what goes on in Africa, what goes on in United States, we've got to come together. When the 192 countries initially came together, we were out of it. But in order to win, you've got to be a team. We've got the collaboration. And for America to be back a part of that team now, I think it is absolutely essential, and it's a step forward, not just for us here, but this is a global issue. Climate change is a non-discriminatory. It doesn't discriminate whether you're a black or tall or European or African. So we all must come together to do it. I think the United States is going to be a major part of working with other countries around the world.
Well, and it's so funny, you gave me the perfect segue about climate not being discriminatory, but we do find that there are people who cause discrimination with climate, especially with people of color. And so the buzzword around the United States and perhaps the world is environmental justice and climate justice. So what does that mean, actually?
I can say from my perspective as someone that is in the career space and making sure people of color have access to careers in the conservation field, climate justice to me, and we know in order to really mitigate and stop the warming of this planet, we're going to have to invest significantly in a workforce that's going to be able to do that. And when I look at the different conservation fields and the representation there and the lack of people of color that are working in those spaces, it's really quite sickening. It's still so homogeneous even in 2021. So I think that's, as Reverend Durley said, that's a civil rights issue. The fact that we're still not seeing people of color represented in these environment, whether it's natural resource management, environmental NGOs, outdoor recreation, across the board, we're seeing so few people of color there. So that's what we're committed to doing, and that's what we know we need. You know, as we talk about the Civilian Climate Corps, which is something that President Biden is very committed to, we have to make sure once again that we're not an afterthought. We have to be at the forefront in making sure that we are a part of the solutions and working on solar and wind and habitat resiliency and disaster response, all the different things that we know that are going to be critical. So for me, that's one of the things that I see. I mean, I know Nataki and Reverend Durley will cover the other areas, but for me, that's kind of what's pressing right now.
Yeah, I think to add on to the piece about, access to these careers that are going to help us to address these challenges, that kind of at a basic level, I think about climate justice as one kind of, it's a part of environmental justice. So climate justice is environmental justice in my opinion. But when I think about the climate piece of it specifically, I'm thinking about the fair treatment of all people, again, regardless of race, ethnicity, income or class, with respect to how environmental and climate policies and projects are created and how they're implemented. So that means that no group of people should be discriminated against. And when we talk about that, that's inclusive of things that are maybe unintentional. But we've got to look at our policies. We've got to look at the projects that are being proposed in cities and towns, all over the United States and in other countries, and look at the impacts that there may be to low-income populations, to communities of color, to those populations that are usually most vulnerable. And we've got to make sure that as we are developing strategies to address climate change, that those communities are not disproportionately impacted. Also, climate justice is this call for us to be proactive instead of reactive in terms of implementing policies and practices that are going to safeguard those communities, keep them safe from pollution, from the impacts of climate change that we see happening every day.
I'm excited about that. The torch has been passed on because they are articulating something that is so essential. We can no longer be the tail lights any longer. We must be in the headlights. We must be shining the direction. When we were over in North Carolina some years ago, when they had the hog farmers, and in the hog farming sections over there, they were having these pits open, and the hog farmers were putting all of the inner parts of the hog in these pits. But it was all in the African-American community there in East North Carolina. It not only polluted the streams, but it impacted their health, it impacted their education, and every part of their life. So going toward a solution, we had to march on Raleigh, North Carolina to bring the awareness. So many times, if we're not at the table, there's a lack of awareness as to the detriment that's negatively, disproportionately impacting the people in those areas. Because the people at the table, they know what they want. They want a bottom line, and that's not everybody. Some want to really do some good for the environment. But it comes down to how do we maximize our profit for our investors. So consequently, we're not a part of that investment team, so it just moves on without us. So we now must be able to sit there to highlight the deprivation that is occurring from a health perspective, from other kinds of areas. That's why what we're talking about, the inclusion, and it starts there that they're in November. So I'm so thankful today that this is being discussed, so that when that what happens in November, that we're at the table to show this. And we're talking about from this perspective, America, but this is global wide. So that's why it's important that minorities, poor communities are at the table, because the investors, we're not in their mindset. And we've got to be a part of that. And they won't know until we put it there. And we've got to, 2 words in the civil rights movement made us strong. 2 words. We've got to be willing to sacrifice and risk. What are we willing to risk and what are we willing to sacrifice? But climate change, we're there, and it's a few of us, as Angela said, she was the only one at the table. Nakagi's been the only one at the table. So now, and the reason for that is very real, because in the African-American community, there's so many other priorities beyond climate change, survival, rent, all of those things. And maybe the climate is in the future, but now the devastation of climate change, and it is not, it is now. When we look at the heat wave that's going on in Georgia, that will be coming up, even though it's cold today, but the heat wave that's coming, that we don't see that. We've got other priorities in front of us. So our job now is to educate, to show that this is destroying us. And we've got to be there with the legislators, with the politicians, with the business people, with the scientists, and with the faith leaders to say, wait a minute, we might not be talking about it that much, but we are negatively, disproportionately impacted, and we pollute the least.
Let me ask this, because I want to take it down to the hyper-local, and especially in Georgia, to give specific examples of how people of color are affected by environmental justice or climate justice, or the lack of it.
So, yeah, I think, there are lots of examples that we could, point to. One thing that we have experienced, even in the city of Atlanta, is, urban flooding. That has been, something, and earlier George Duesenberry talked about the Cook Park development, and that 16 acres is there available for that park to be developed because people were removed from that property. You had over 60 homes that had been flooded out multiple times, but there was a big flood that happened around 2002, and people essentially lost they lost their homes as a result of that. So that's just one example, and while some of that is sort of intertwined, not just with the more intense, storms that we expect to see, the more precipitation that we expect to see, and are already experiencing with respect to climate change. But it's, intermingled in that are things like inadequate, infrastructure in some of our communities. And so that's where you begin to see how all this is linked together. It's not just the natural, as you mentioned earlier, Jocelyn, it's the unnatural things as well. It's the human-made things. It's kind of these acts of omission and commission, right? That have contributed to the conditions that we see in our communities, that make certain communities a lot more vulnerable to these climate-related risks. So that the urban flooding is just one piece, but we could also move out to the coast and look at what's happening, in Sapelo Island and other places where people are losing their lands. So there are lots of different impacts, but I don't want to dominate the conversation. I'll let others, kind of chime in as well.
Well, I'll just add to that the whole resilience piece. The fact that there's so many communities of color here in Atlanta that are not climate resilient, they're not prepared. So there's an awareness piece, an education piece, but there's also disaster response. So in the event, there's no water, there's no access to food, what will you do? So that's another thing that we're focusing on, is going into these communities with our youth corps and raising the level of awareness and the response, like getting the preparedness of different communities. But again, and also, we're working with different partners on green infrastructure in the city of Atlanta so that we can combat, as Nataki said, some of the urban flooding that's happening, like in Vine City and so forth. So, unfortunately, and then also looking at the disparate impact or how this is actually related to public health. But the fact, I just read something that shows that communities of color, particularly here in Atlanta, are not receiving the vaccine as quickly as others as it relates to COVID. So, we're seeing a lot of disparate treatment as it relates to the city of Atlanta and Georgia in particular. So these are things that here in the South that we are, really focusing on, because and then you can see how it just kind of mushrooms out. But our focus is really resilience and making sure when things do happen, we know that we're in the middle of this global emergency, but when it does hit your neighborhood, what does that mean exactly? What will you be prepared to do?
And when I take off my advocacy hat and put on my pastoral hat, that's when I'm in the hospitals and I see children gasping from asthmatic conditions. I see many of the other kinds of funerals that we've had to do with people that have from heat strokes where the older people could not. Then when the heat is so high and the air conditioning goes out, the economic aspect comes in where they cannot afford their the cost for the electric. So we fight with Georgia Power to try to put up new kinds of programs that can do it, that can help them with the bills, because they're trying to run the air conditioning and cooling, and all of that's impacted, and it's psychologically and spiritually can be devastating. So consequently, we've got to combine not only one side, but the human devastation of climate change in our communities, particularly here in Atlanta, with the asthmatic condition, even with the cancer down there, when Nataki was talking about in Louisiana, that cancer row down there. And Martin Luther King used to call these islands of poverty. The islands of poverty is what he called it. And he said, these are islands of poverty. And if you remember, when you connect the dots between the civil rights and what we're doing now, he was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, fighting for the garbage workers.
Yeah.
Those who were picking up the garbage in the streets, trying to clean up. Sanitation is a key part of that. So it's all interrelated and interconnected at this time. So when you look at the human devastation, the economic devastation, and the children last year here in Atlanta with that long trip could not even go to school in some cases that they had to go, even though it was summer out, many of them were supposed to be making up. So all of those things are and we as a inner city group are suffering disproportionately to this whole concern, negatively.
And it's interesting that you brought up heat. Excuse me, I have to cough. But it's interesting that you brought up the whole issue of heat, I just saw something from The Guardian that was showing that neighborhoods in the United States particularly were designed to not have as many trees in low income and people of color areas, and that heat really has an impact. But do you think that we as people of color are really aware as a group of all of these things that are impacting us?
I would say that we're not, there are groups of us that are aware, there are some that aren't aware, but this is why I always say it's so important to have an intersectional approach to engaging people of color around these environmental issues. You know, we have to, it's about how we talk about it. It's about how we, you know, broach these different subjects. You know, when we're talking about, you know, the importance of trees and, you know, how do we make that a priority given all the other things that we know Black people are dealing with, right? So, you know, making sure, like, when we're trying to get them involved with different projects and we're asking for volunteers, like, are they able to volunteer given what has happened and given the hundreds of years of oppression? You know, we have to make sure we are making this message resonate with people of color, and because it is absolutely incorrect to make this blanket statement that people of color are not interested in the environment when we see that we vote, you know, for environmental referendums, and, you know, we support environmental issues more than most when it comes to voting. So that's not it. It's just about, you know, how we approach the issue. I think our President Barack Obama said you can't talk about sustainability in people of color without talking about economics. So, you know, it's really about how you approach and broach the subject. But I do think that there are people of color, Black people, who are very much aware of the benefits and what we need to do. But there is a large group that isn't aware. So it's incumbent upon all of us on this call to make sure that we are bringing our brothers and sisters along in the, you know, raising that level of awareness.
What do you see as solutions? And I should mention that we have time for Q&A, and I see some questions are coming in, but I do want to get to solutions and ideas of how we move forward in the future.
Well, I think both of them hit up on it. First of all, it starts with a level of awareness. One of the things, and again, I keep switching hats here, is that you can get up in the pulpit all day long and talk about heaven and hell. And it won't mean that much to people because that's not you're frightening people. But when you can get to someone's gut to understand that when all else fails, you've got to go down inside of yourself to find something to carry you through. So we can talk about all the statistics about the greenhouse gases and what carbon dioxide is doing. It doesn't resonate until we start talking about some of the issues that we've discussed, that we make it real in terms of healthcare, in terms of economics. Then people begin, because Black folks, we are survivors. We know how to survive. And in order to survive, you got to make it, as Dr. King's father used to say, make it plain. Once we make it plain, we know the statistics. Anyone here can quote all the statistics, and when you finish, you say, what did he say, or what did she say, or what did that mean? But when you make it real, that this is killing it, and we need you downtown to stand up. So the first solution, stand together to challenge the Public Service Commission here in the state of Georgia and what they're doing over there with the nuclear plant and what that means over there in Burke County. They're dying there. And when we went over there to fight that, they told us to get out because they finally had a job, but the job was destroyed. Then once they began to understand that what they were doing was killing many of the people there, or at least making them sick, then they said, what do we need to do? So that's what I think is making it real in our concern. This happened to us years ago when HIV came. We thought it was just a white male gay disease, and we were staying away. And once it started getting into the Black community, we began to understand why we need to come together, because we're all in this together.
I would say that it's going to take a coordinated approach. So just ditto to everything that Reverend Gurley just talked about. But it's going to take the education that we've already mentioned. It's going to take civic engagement. When we talk about the Public Service Commission, or even right now, there is a new bill that has been introduced, an environmental justice bill that has been introduced into the Georgia State Legislature. It's going to take that civic engagement, holding elected officials accountable, making sure that they are addressing these issues in the policies that they are helping to shape and create and pass. That's going to be very important. It's going to be about diversifying environmental and conservation organizations, preparing that workforce. We have different colleges and universities. All three of us are graduates of historically Black colleges and universities. We are preparing, our young people to take on these roles. But we've got to make sure that those roles are available for them to move into those jobs and to do the work that is going to help to propel us forward.
Thank you so much. And I shout out to HBCUs, because I think this is huge that the three of us represent, and I'm always honored to be on panels with my Spelman sister, Nataki. I think, what I'm going to say is innovation. We need to bring young minds and innovation to these problems. We can't solve all these problems with these little ad hoc solutions. Like, we really need to think bold, and we need to be aggressive, but we need to make sure we have people at the leadership and people at the table that are empathetic, people that care about one another, because I think that that's in large part what we're seeing. As you said, Reverend Gurley, there are people that are just thinking of the bottom line, that are just thinking of a business perspective. And what it is a green economy, but we care about people. We need to care about those that are being impacted. So I would say, having empathetic leaders at the table and leading in some of these initiatives, but also having Black and brown people a part of the workforce, so that we know that there are no communities that and demographics that are going to be left out of the solution.
Let me just say to what they just said. We just finished 2 years ago a 10-city tour. I was with the Hip Hop Caucus, and we went to 10 historically Black colleges and universities. And we were at Howard in North Carolina, A&T, Texas Southern. And what we were doing was we were talking to the young people. It's good to major in sociology, psychology, engineering, but we need to begin to look at environmental issues. We need to look at alternative issues and begin to put we got to build the base. There are people now already planning 10 to 15 years from now. So we've got to get that younger group to think about an alternative form of education. As I told some of them, don't talk to me about putting up solar panels. Talk to me about owning the company that makes the panels.
Amen.
Don't just talk about we're going to do it. No, own that. Understand the economics around it and get in early, because the millions of jobs that they're talking about, they're not talking about us in those jobs. So you got to create those jobs. So as you talk about the other majors on these campuses, then now let's begin to put in specifically and begin to create that early on. I congratulate the two Spelman sisters, because they were doing things on Spelman's campus with solar and some years ago, and still moving ahead. But we've got to move that much further now, putting grids on much of the land, solar grids on the land that on these historically Black colleges, but training our young people early about this fascinating futuristic field that is here now.
And if I'm sorry, Jocelyn, one last thing. And I think to Reverend Gurley's point, that we're doing at Green Youth Foundation, we have an international fellowship program where we're connecting students from HBCUs to different countries working on climate issues. So we're actually, there's two companies in London that we're working with, that we're going to be sending students from HBCUs to work on those issues. So it's important, as we said earlier, unfortunately, there's no walls. This climate has no, it doesn't say this country, not that country. So we need to start working globally together on solutions. So I'm really, happy about this discussion that the British Consulate has kind of brought to the forefront, because we do need to start working more as a global team.
And I would ask the takeaway. What do you want? We've got a lot of people on this conversation, and I want to have you issue a challenge to them. What can individuals do? Walking out of this conversation, what would you suggest they do?
I would say start locally, start in your home in terms of doing things that you know are good for the environment so that you can be stewards, but also to support groups that are out there that are doing the work on the ground, you know, the advocacy, you know, whether it's providing jobs, whether it's, you know, in religion, spirituality, you know, you have to reach outside of your own comfort zone and connect to people that are working on this issue, because it is a global emergency that requires all of our attention.
Great.
No, I totally agree. Everything that she just said is going to be absolutely critical. And do not let stereotypes, myths destroy your ability to go beyond, because sometimes people will get there and they'll say, oh, well, you know, these Black folks, they don't want to do nothing. No. It's so easy to fall into that trap. If anything that the three of us have said today is that we're, particularly in our communities, we're suffering at a disproportionate rate, but we want to get involved. We want to get involved. So open up the door, open up the table, open up the conversation. But before you can open up any of that, you have to open up your mind. Open up your mind that we come together because each one of us brings different perspectives to the solution around climate change. So I think that's going to, if anybody walked away, if they got up and turned it off and say, I'm leaving the meeting, I'm going, but today I'm going to go and talk to somebody who is different than me, who has a different perspective than me, because the differences make us stronger and make our effort and our movement much more valuable.
Well said. I would just say it's all about the diversity of thought, diversity of people who can come together to help generate those solutions. And we cannot forget those disproportionately impacted, who are closest to the ground, closest to a lot of the challenges. These are also the same folks who will lead us in developing the solutions.
And I think that people should take note, even though they see your names, that there are organizations right here in this panel that people can get involved with. The Watershed, WAWA, the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, the Greening Youth Foundation, the Interfaith Power and Light. These are all organizations that, if you're not in Georgia, you know, you can begin to look at least some of the organizations around the country that do it. It's interesting that I see the comments. I am looking at the comments that are coming in. And one of the things that people have emphasized is the fact that we need to really start educating our young people, K through 12, in a curriculum. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, or whether you see that going on.
Well, that's how we started, as providing environmental education to young people, and focusing on young people of color, because we wanted to make sure the playing field was level, because we were seeing that they were not receiving, you know, the curriculum and the information and having access to the activities that, you know, other young people were having. So that is how we started, and we maintain our environmental education program. We've had to pivot and make it digital. So now it's the green box, in which we provide, you know, materials for them that we send to them, and then, you know, we have an online platform for them to follow. But we've collaborated with WAWA, and I'm sure Nataka will want to share some of the things that they're doing as well.
Yeah, we definitely think that K through 12 education is vitally important. In fact, the way that we do our education at WAWA, it's K to grade. So it's our babies, as well as our elders and seniors, who not only have a lot to learn, but also have a lot to teach. When we think about that we all come out of, and really our connections to the earth, to the environment, that maybe we've been disconnected from them at some point, but they are a part of our history. And so that K through 12 work is really important. We work with schools all across Atlanta, but we try to focus in terms of making our impact on schools on the west side of Atlanta. We do education in the classrooms, as well as bring children to places like the Outdoor Activity Center, the Cascade Springs Nature Preserve, which are amazing, that are in Southwest Atlanta, that we help to steward along with the city of Atlanta and with other community-based groups. And so teaching young people in particular is so very important. And that beginning of knowledge about earth systems, about nature, also is that good foundation to not only making sure that they will be making responsible choices as they grow up, but also that they might have some interest in moving into some of these, into the environmental and sustainability fields.
And young people like excitement. See, we're in competition with the Atlanta Housewives on TV. And when I got in the movement, I met some of the smartest, wealthiest people about an issue, but they were dull. They were very dull, and it was very dry. And I couldn't even get excited about it. They talked about what was going on here in the wild, and this frog over here. But we're at a point now where we've got to, and young people got to be excited. I am so optimistic now about young people, and I saw it during the George Floyd, when young people of all colors came to Atlanta, and they knew a cause. They had a cause, and the cause was around justice and equality. And when young people get a hold of it, the parents have to step back and learn from the young people. So I think that that's going to be critical, what they're doing now with the young people, because the young people have the energy. They have the energy to go. And if you think about energy, just energy, and that's what we're talking about. If water comes into a community and water comes at a fast pace, they call it a flood. But if you take that same energy and that same water and you put some parameters around it, they call it irrigation. It's just channeling the energy. And then things will grow when we channel the energy. The energy is there with our young people. And we got to get excited about it, because everybody else is in competition for their minds and for their energy. All we've got to do now, and that's what we're talking about, is channeling that energy so that crops will grow rather than it being a flood and they destroy everything in front of them. So I'm very optimistic now after all these years to see the kind of synergy. And now we're taking that same and moving it toward environmental justice and the mitigation of climate change. And I think it's a great time to be in the movement. But they got to understand this. A group of Black Lives Matter people met with me down at a place called The Gathering Spot. And they said to me, Dr. Durley, we want to do just like you all did in the 60s. And I didn't say anything. So I said, we want to do just like you did in the 60s. I said, you can't. They say, why? I say, this is not the 60s.
Right.
Absolutely.
Different day.
In the 60s, we couldn't just get out. We'd have been in jail or under the jail if you did. You got so much flexibility. You got social media. Use what you have in the 2021. That's what we did in the 60s. That was just foundation. You have a future and a bright future ahead, taking the environment and making it a meaningful part of your life on all aspects, political, educational, and economic.
And I should add that as a member of the Board of Advisors of the Trust for Public Land, first of all, the Trust for Public Land is a national organization. So those of you who are not in Georgia can look it up and see that one of the missions of the Trust, and one of the reasons I got involved, was not only the urban park initiative to really replace the many park deserts in the United States and in Georgia, and to try to give make a 10-minute walk within a park for every American, for every Georgian. And we don't have that here in Georgia. So that's why Cook Park is also not only mitigating the flood damage, but also giving park and recreational opportunities for those in neighborhoods who otherwise didn't have those opportunities. Also, we have a schoolyards project where we're looking at making schoolyards available to the community when schools are not in session. And the cool thing about that is we've got young people involved in trying to figure out what types of recreation should be in these parks. And it's exciting to see them. I was in a session where they were actually designing boulders, a boulder that's going to be going in the Cook Park. So these are things that people can look at and get involved with. We are running out of time. I'm looking at our time, and I'd like to turn it back to the Consul General's office to wrap us up. Thank you so much for all of you who have been a part of it. It's been a great education for me, and hopefully a great education for all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn, and to the other panelists. The first word that comes into my mind is wow. I think you've fulfilled Reverend Durley's challenge of making it plain and making it real today. The themes that come into my mind from the discussion are the important ones around diversity of thought, fairness, inclusiveness, health, but also doing this at a local level so it makes sense, but really stressing that opportunity for all. So we need to be great leaders, we need to be great collaborators, great coordinators, great inspirers, great researchers, but most importantly, great educators. And the UK government's willing to play its role both domestically and internationally to make that. I really love Reverend Durley's analogy of no longer being in the taillights, but being in the headlights. And one day those headlights will be part of an electric vehicle in the future. So thank you to everybody who's joined us. We're more than happy to continue this conversation, and are looking to work with partners to make climate change, climate ambition real for everybody. Thank you.